This video will not be a review of Rebel Moon, but I will talk about this film too. So guys, how are you? I hope you are well. I am the Monio, the interdimensional demon, who talks the most about Zack Snyder's films on YouTube, and you are on my channel. Firstly, if you are a fan of Zack Snyder, don't be irritated by the things I'm going to say in this video. Just comment what you disagree with, politely, okay? Well, let's start by contextualizing some things we need to understand. Zack Snyder is one of the most talked about and well-known directors today. Some love the guy, others hate him. He has directed films like 300 and Watchmen, and was mainly responsible for creating the old DC cinematic universe, the famous Snyderverse. And since the DC cinematic universe, I already have an opinion about the way Zack Snyder does things, and how he couldn't capture the essence of the characters. A Superman who didn't inspire anyone, a Batman who didn't care about his rule of not killing, a version of Lex Luthor that becomes an insult to those who are fans of the character, and many other things. And this was represented in its maximum in the film Batman vs. Superman, which defined the people who would be fans unconditional, comments from Snyder, and defined those who definitely do not consider him a good director. And one thing worth highlighting has always been Zack Snyder's position in relation to criticism, which is a position that has always been replicated by his fanbase, which is not to accept the defects in the work. So it's not that the script is meaningless, in fact the script is too complex for you. It's not that the character is poorly developed, you don't understand the proposal. Snyder always sold this idea that the DC films he made were darker and more adult than the competition, and this became so popular that many people started to see DC Comics with this perspective. People said that the Marvel was colorful and happy, and DC was dark, and that was never true. Of course, at DC, there have always been magazines and editorial lines aimed at adults, with darker stories, and focused on horror, but the superhero universe has always been optimistic and hopeful. And this idea of something adult and dark has always been a kind of trademark of Snyder's films. The problem is that this is only reflected in the visuals, in the aesthetics that Snyder uses. And don't get me wrong, apart from the color palette of the Instagram filter he uses, I like the aesthetics that Snyder uses. The look of the DC heroes designed by him, in my opinion, they look very beautiful. Despite having an interesting aesthetic, the lack of development in the script and the lack of depth of the characters has always been a big problem in Snyder's films, as well as his directorial defects, such as excessive slow motion, his opaque color palette, and the length of the films, which became increasingly longer, with the peak in the Justice League Snyder Cut, lasting more than 4 hours. And in the director's first films, when he still didn't exaggerate in these aspects, the color palette matched the epic and funereal tone of 300, the slow motion, which he used more sparingly, became a reference in medieval battle scenes. But over time, Snyder exaggerated his directorial shortcomings more and more, reaching the point where he became a kind of parody of himself. And that brings us to the fateful new film by Zack Snyder, which would be a Star Wars made by him. And when I say it would be a Star Wars, it's because in fact it would be. Snyder had this Rebel Moon project a few years ago, and he tried to sell it to Disney to be a Star Wars film. Disney wasn't interested, and he shelved the project so that one day, when a big company would finance him, he could make his own Star Wars. Well, that day came. Netflix bought the project, as they wanted to have their own Star Wars franchise, and they probably accepted Snyder's project, probably because of the success of Justice League Snyder Cut, which was one of the streaming films which was most successful on the internet at the time of its release, and a director's version for this film has already been announced, which will be released later. The film can be summarized as a group of farmers who live on a moon and grow food for their people. An evil army arrives and demands food from those people, and says they will return in 10 months to collect the food. So the protagonist decides to gather the most powerful warriors to defend the farmers from the evil army. But the Monio, how does she do it exactly? She basically finds the warrior, and says, "Hello warrior, would you like to join us on this suicide mission, to defend people you don't know?" And the warrior responds, "Of course I want to, I was just looking for a reason to die." Seriously guys, the characters are so shallow, that the impression I have is that Snyder is unable to attribute more than one characteristic to each character at the same time, which makes them all boring and without personality. And the precariousness of the script, it makes everything so uninteresting that the result is an extremely boring film that I couldn't finish. The conclusion I came to watching this film is that it is the most Zack Snyder film among Zack Snyder's films. It is probably the film that has the most slow motion, that has the most digital aesthetic with opaque colors that he uses. The film is not excessively long, like the director's other films, but its Snyder Cut version will probably be much longer. After watching part of the film, I was wondering why Snyder is so insistent on using more and more of these directorial defects, for which he is so criticized. Did he get to the point of simply ignoring the criticism and doing that even more just to spite those who criticize him? I don't rule out this possibility, as Snyder doesn't react well to criticism. He doesn't try to minimize the things that are highlighted as defects, and he doesn't try to improve. In my opinion, he always prioritizes the opinion of those who insist on saying that he is a director genius. And although Rebel Moon is a cross-section of several things, like Seven Samurai, by Kurosawa, Star Wars, and other things, he is a director who tries to do new things. These things, most of the time, are not good, but he tries. I truly believe that if Snyder accepted his flaws and tried to find collaborators who could make up for this deficiency, his films would be much better, or if he at least accepted the criticism and tried to work on his weaknesses better, since he is not a good director of actors, in the sense of being able to extract a good performance from his cast, and he is also not good at working on minimally complex scripts, which results in many plot holes in his films, and nonsensical things. I think the best solution for Zack Snyder would be for him to limit himself to making films that make better use of his qualities as a director, and yes, he has qualities. For example, his aesthetic is interesting, he has beautiful cinematography, and the most interesting thing is that he knows how to film action, which is not easy. Quentin Tarantino already mentioned in one of his filmmakings that he has some difficulty doing his action scenes, that it's not easy, and that only good directors can do good action scenes. Considering that Zack Snyder can make very good action scenes, he could stand out more by making productions that highlight his qualities more, and hide his defects more, and as much as I understand that slow motion, and other characteristics of Snyder's films, are a kind of trademark of the director, he doesn't need to exaggerate these aspects so much, to the point that he becomes a parody of himself. And this doesn't just apply to Snyder, as there are very few directors who manage to do well in different genres. Perhaps Spielberg is the best example, but in this case we are talking about a genius, who has directed some of cinema's greatest classics. But there's no problem focusing on more specific things, and a good example of this is the director of John Wick, who is a former stuntman, and a specialist in choreography and action scenes, who makes his films with a relatively simple script, and makes the action and fight scenes the main differentiator of his film. I believe that Snyder would do very well differentiating a film about Greek gods, whose script was not written by him, but in the case of Rebel Moon, which is practically a Star Wars universe directed, scripted and produced by Snyder, it is difficult to enjoy the guy's qualities. But what about you? Are you a fan of Zack Snyder? Do you think that he is actually a genius and that his films are too big for small minds? Leave it in the comments, and if you liked the video, subscribe to follow the next content. Until next time my people, demonic hugs.